All right, so we are looking at Psalm number 4 tonight. As we continue our way through the Psalms. All right. Okay, so we start with our summary of this psalm. Psalm 4 unites the covenant community of Israel around shared faith in God. And hopefully that will make sense by the time we get through this psalm. Brief outline of the psalm. Verse 1, David's call. Verses 2 to 5, David's charge. Verses 6 to 8, David's confidence. Okay, so we'll go to our observations about this psalm. It was a psalm written by David. The superscription ascribes it to David. There's no information as to any specific occasion. It's just simply to the chief musician, Old Neganoth, a psalm of David. So we don't know any specific occasion. There's some that would place it with Psalm 3, with the rebellion of Absalom. I saw some others suggesting that it was when David was fleeing from Saul, or during a time of famine, during David's reign. There's some other times pointed to. And there's probably a number of the troubles that David encountered that could be relevant to the psalm. So we can't really be certain. But the psalm does fit the time around the rebellion with Absalom better than any other instance that I could really think of. So we're not certain of the occasion, but this psalm is from David, and he is addressing those who are opposing his kingship. So you see in the superscription, it's directed to the chief musician. We're not entirely certain about who the chief musician was or who they were and exactly what the function was that they performed. But it seems that the word itself that's used does have the idea of supervisor in it. And so the chief musician would be someone that was responsible for the singing and the musical accompaniment in the worship, the temple services, and so on. Now the word there, the neganoth that is mentioned, actually refers to stringed instruments, such as a harp, something like that. So this psalm was sung as a part of worship, and it would have been accompanied by various instruments. There's actually numerous instruments that are mentioned throughout the Psalms, numerous instruments that were used, strings, percussion, various kind of things that were used. I'm sorry, lost my place. Oh yeah, and the Psalm also has two selahs in it, at the end of verse 2 and at the end of verse 4. And again, those are directions for rests, for pauses in the singing or the music, or possibly an interlude. Just not entirely sure how those were handled exactly, but it does have two of them. All right, so some would categorize this psalm as a lament, but it doesn't really seem to fit entirely with the conventions of a lament. It probably would be more along the line of a confidence psalm, a psalm that's expressing confidence in God, a psalm that is exhorting to faith and trust in God. So let's walk through this psalm. It's pretty short, has 8 verses, so we will read it first. Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. O ye sons of men, how long will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after leasing? Selah. But know that the Lord hath set apart him that is godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call unto him. Stand in awe and sin not. Commune with your own heart upon your bed and be still. Selah. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. There be many that say, Who will show us any good, Lord? Lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. Thou hast put gladness in my heart more than in the time that their corn and their wine increased. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. So the psalm begins in verse 1 with David calling out to God. He refers to, O God of my righteousness, and this reference to God's righteousness is a reference to God's faithfulness to His Word, and particularly His faithfulness to His Word in dealing with His people. And so it's God's righteousness that is the ground of David's confidence as he is calling out in prayer. He mentions that he had been enlarged when he was in distress. Now, the word for distress refers to a narrow or a tight place. So it's like a confined space. And the word for enlarged actually refers to a wide or a broad open space. So this is an instance where the psalm is, the aspect of poetry comes in. There's a use of imagery here that's not really exactly metaphor or simile. There's a use of imagery of being in a tight, confined, enclosed space. And I don't know, anyone claustrophobic? Well, if you've ever been in a tight space, or maybe even if you have, some anxiety, you get in a large crowd of people and pressed in, you can really get worried there.
Stage.
What's that?
Crawl under that stage.
Yeah, so those tight spaces can be confining, and just think of the relief when you step into the wide open or whatever that it is. I went in West Virginia a number of times. I went through various caves and not guided tours. Coveralls, lights, the whole works. And so some of them had. I remember one feature in one of the caves was called the Cannon's Mouth. Is what this passage was called. And you were crawling on your stomach for, I'm wanting to say it's close to 100 yards. So you're in this cave, total darkness, and you're basically worming your way through. Now, you get through to the other side, it opens up into this big chamber, and that happens a lot of times in caves. You squeeze through tight spaces and opens up into this big chamber, and it's such a relief. So it's just I'm just pointing this out because it's an example of how imagery works in poetry. So it's not just information, but it's actually bringing you into the experience. You know what it's like to be confined and in a tight space, and the relief you feel when you come into an open space in the fresh air or whatever that it may be. So it's just an aspect of how that poetry works. It doesn't come across in English as well. He hath enlarged me when I was in distress, and I think some translations maybe have relieved me when I was in distress, but it doesn't really capture the imagery of the words that are used. But nevertheless, that's expressing that distress and relief. So he prays, "Have mercy upon me," and it's a prayer that is reflecting the covenant blessing that is on Israel in Numbers chapter 6 and verse 25, when the priest would pronounce covenant blessing upon Israel. And actually the same word appears there, but it's translated gracious in Numbers 6:25. Now, this is the last part of Numbers 6:25. This "have mercy upon me" or "be gracious to me." And he's also going to refer to later phrases in that blessing later in this psalm. And so that is something that contributes to the theme in this psalm. So then we come to that next group of verses, verses 2 to 5. And you notice that beginning with verse 2, David is addressing the sons of men. So he's referring, by sons of men, he's referring to the people of Israel. And when you look at this psalm as a whole, and you see David's use of the word us in verse number 6, you see that he is referring to the people of Israel. By referring to the sons of men, he is referring especially to leaders, especially to people in more prominent positions among the society and nation of Israel. Now, he speaks about in verse 2, asking, how long will you turn my glory into shame and love vanity and seek after leasing? So they had opposed David as king, and they had shamed his glory or honor. Now, the word for glory here, the Hebrew kavod, and it's actually a word literally means heavy, but it's a word that has quite a range of meaning, but it refers to David's place as God's anointed king. And we saw the word used in Psalm 3 and verse 3, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. And when we looked at that psalm, we saw how those verses referred to David's kingship as well. So he's referring to when they shamed David's glory, they were shaming his place as king. They were being opposed to his place. And he speaks of them seeking after vanity and lies. The word leasing there indicates falsehood. And this most likely refers to their seeking of the benefits and the blessings of covenant promises, but seeking those outside of covenant faithfulness. In other words, they're wanting the good things that had been promised and spoken of to them, and they're wanting to experience those things. However, out of their discontent and their frustration, they're trying to find some other way to get those things. And again, that would answer very well with the rebellion under Absalom and trying to replace David as king. He mentions in verse 3, the Lord has set apart him that is godly for himself. And the word that's used for godly there is a word that is often translated saints. But it's the word hasid, and it is closely related to the Hebrew word hesed, which hesed is usually steadfast love, loving kindness, something of that sort. It's a word that has a particular covenantal association, that it's a covenantal love, a covenantal kindness from God, and hasid is related to that word. So it has overtones of one who is in faithful covenant relation to God. So he says God has set apart him that is in faithful covenant relation with God. The word is also interestingly used in reference to the Messiah in Psalm 16:10, where he's referred to there as the Holy One. But it's further reinforced that he's speaking of covenant faithfulness in the language of being set apart, and that David has confidence that the Lord will hear when he prays. In other words, he is one of his. And so he has confidence that God will hear him. Similar to the expression in Psalm 3 and verse 4, when the Lord answered him. In verse 4, in Psalm 4, it says to stand in awe and sin not. And the word for awe has quite a range of meaning. It can refer to trembling out of fear. It can refer to trembling with anger. So it can have a range of meaning. Now, Paul quotes this verse in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26. What does he say there? Does anybody remember?
Be ye angry and sin not.
Yeah. Be angry and sin not. So Paul takes the meaning of this word here as anger. Now, again, it could be fear, it could be reverence, it could be anger, it could be a lot of things as far as the Hebrew term is concerned. Now, there's not, the word in the Greek that Paul uses is not like that. I mean, it means anger specifically. So Paul understood this to be speaking of anger. He uses the verse that way in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26. Paul also uses similar imagery when he talks about not letting the sun go down upon your wrath. And David here refers, stand in awe and sin not, commune with your own heart upon your bed, and be still. So there is another close association there. So what he is exhorting these sons of men and the people of Israel, he's exhorting them to search their hearts and not sin out of anger. And that's the way that Paul uses the verse in Ephesians chapter 4, not to sin out of anger. He also mentions here, tells them to be still. Be still is used in Psalm 46:10, and it's used there to speak of patiently waiting for God to perform His will. So be still, obviously having the sense of silence and of waiting, not grumbling and complaining against God, not questioning His faithfulness or bringing His character into question, but waiting for Him to fulfill His will. And then David further exhorts them to offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put their trust in the Lord. The offering of sacrifices he's referring to is the offering of right sacrifices. So in other words, the phrase would include offering sacrifices that are proper in terms of the right animals or whatever that's required, but also it would include offering right sacrifices in terms of the heart, that their attitude and their approach to God through those sacrifices. Now ultimately, what he's telling them in this verse is to be faithful, to walk faithfully in what God requires, and to put their confidence, their whole trust in God. They don't need to seek some other way to try to arrive at the blessings that they are expecting, but to be faithful and put their confidence in God. So the last part of the psalm then, verses 6 to 8, David is speaking again to God. He talks about how that there are many that say, who will show us any good? There were many in Israel who were disheartened, who were discontent, those that had unfulfilled expectations. And so David refers to that, and then he prays more of the covenant blessing from Numbers chapter 6, when he says, Lord, lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. So the light of God's countenance speaks of His favor, of His presence among His people, of His hearing of their cries and their pleas, and of His answering their prayers, and of His delivering them from trouble and delivering them into the blessings that He has promised. He talks about in verse 7 how that God had put gladness in His heart more than the time that their corn and wine increased. So David speaks here of having a great joy, and having a joy that exceeded the joy over physical blessings, such as at harvest time. And that phrase about the corn and wine increase is a reference to harvest time. So David's saying that from God, he had a greater joy in heart than from physical blessings, which would also mean on the other side of that David's joy would not be lacking when those physical blessings were not present, when maybe the corn and wine decreased rather than increasing. And then in verse 8, once again, he lays down and he sleeps. So this is much like in Psalm 3 and verse 5. So what was the meaning of that in Psalm 3?
You didn't have to worry about things, let God take care of it.
Right. So his confidence was in God, God's faithfulness to his own promises. So ultimately, it's not David who would end the crisis, but God. So that's the image that we're given, laying down, peacefully sleeping, because it's not dependent on David. David's not saying that there's nothing required of him, but what he is saying is that it's not dependent on him. Rather, he is dependent on God. And because God is who he is, and God never fails, then he can sleep peacefully, because God will fulfill all of his word. Okay, so let's go to interpretation. What does Psalm 4 mean? Psalm 4 has God's righteousness, his covenant faithfulness, as the foundation of David's joy and his confidence in the midst of troubles. So when you look at Psalm 4 and you start seeing the words that are used, the phrases that are used, you realize there are various references in the psalm that would be associated with God's covenant promises. In verses 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, all have those references. Again, the term God's righteousness is typically in reference to his faithfulness to his covenant. In verse 2, when he speaks about his glory, that would be associated with God's covenant anointing and putting David as king. Verse number 3, the Lord setting apart him that is godly. In verse number 5, when he refers to the sacrifices of righteousness, and in verse number 6, when he quotes especially from the latter part of that covenantal blessing from Numbers chapter number 6. So in other words, the God's covenant faithfulness is just sort of underlying everything in Psalm number 4. And so the point is that David trusted God despite the circumstances that he was enduring. And he and Israel were obviously in distress. Through faith, then, what do we see? That David had, number one, assurance of God hearing his prayers. He speaks about that in verse number 1. Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. In other words, David refers to past faithfulness that God has shown, past deliverance that God has worked for him, and he is praying to God in confidence that this is a pattern of God's faithfulness, that he has been faithful in the past and he's going to be faithful in the future. David also, as a result of faith, had joy of heart. And then we saw in verse number 7. And in verse 8, he had peaceful sleep, and he also had a future hope. All right, Psalm 4 also speaks a word to the discontented. So unfulfilled expectations, along with difficult circumstances and strong emotional responses, provide ample opportunity for sin. So when he speaks of, in verse 4, stand in awe and sin not. And then he goes on through the next verse, giving a description of what they were to do. So we read about a people that in verse 2 were shaming David. And what we have to understand is that David is not just any man. He's not just any king. He's God's anointed covenant king. And so for them to be shaming David, it's more than just a personal insult that they're guilty of. His glory points to his position as God's anointed king. So what this means is, in their shaming David, more than just insulting David's person, they're actually insulting and shaming God's anointed, which means they're opposing God in what they're doing. through their opposition of David. Furthermore, in verse 2, he shows how that they were chasing after vanity and lies. In other words, they were looking for other ways outside of God's appointed ways. They're looking for other ways instead of patiently waiting for God. And in verse 6, we hear the word from them that expresses their unbelief of hopelessness. And well, who's going to show us any good? They thought their circumstances to be so desperate that they had no hope in God. So what was the answer for them? Well, the answer was for them to examine themselves and to patiently wait for God, as he mentions in verse 4. And in verse 5, to do the works of righteousness with full confidence in God. In other words, yes, maybe circumstances are difficult, and maybe the situation is desperate, and maybe you are disappointed that promises have not been fulfilled either in the time or in the way that you think that they should be. But regardless of that, responsibility is still fixed. You be faithful to God. You do what God requires of you, and you have full confidence in Him. So you're not going to resort to some sort of outside measure or outside means. You don't want to step outside of faithfulness to God to try to get something to yourself. All right, so that brings us to the Messianic Hope in Psalm number 4. So when David referred to my glory in verse number 2, and that he was set apart and godly in verse number 3, he's acknowledging in this psalm his position as God's anointed covenant king. Now, what is hard for us to comprehend is that David seems to have had a full sense of his position. In other words, the place that he had been put in by God as the anointed king and as having received the covenant from God. He understood the position that he held. And from that position, he issues rebukes like what we see here in Psalm 4, because opposition to him and objection to him is actually opposition and objection to God. Now, one of the things that is remarkable about David is that while he had that understanding of the place that God had placed him, he also had the self-awareness and understanding to know that he wasn't it. He wasn't the anointed king that was to come. He wasn't the fulfillment of the covenant that God made with him. Rather, he was the recipient of it. So David understood that. And so he could rebuke those of Israel who were opposing him as king and objecting to his kingship as you're actually opposing God. You're actually leaving covenant faithfulness to seek some means. So David knew that he was a figure of the true anointed king to come. But he found himself at odds with many in Israel who were unbelieving or faithless. So what we see in Psalm 4 is David attempting a reconciliation. And I think that really comes out when you get down to that verse 6 and you see that us that David talks about, praying for God to lift up His countenance on us. David is seeking a reconciliation. He's wanting to unite them together in faith and trust in God to bring His Messiah, His anointed, to Israel. So this would also agree with his attempts at reconciliation after the death of Absalom that you read about in 2 Samuel chapter number 19. So when David expressed confidence in God's hearing his prayers, we read of God answering him in the context of what we've seen that's come before. He mentions in verse 4 of Psalm 3, I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and He heard me out of His holy hill. And so what's the significance of God answering David out of the holy hill? Well, we go back to Psalm 2, and in verse 6, we see God's answer to the raging of the nations, "Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion." In other words, the answer to David's prayers is God installing his king on the holy hill of Zion, there on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In other words, the coming of the Messiah. So even in his lifetime, David is praying for, longing for, and looking for that seed that is to come. He knows that it's not him. So David's hope is not, when facing these difficulties, and we know that David had a lot of stumbles and a lot of problems. He failed in many ways. But David's hope was ultimately not in himself, not in his military ability, not in his diplomatic ability, not in anything else in himself. His hope was in God, who had promised to raise up a seed after David to establish his throne and his kingdom forever. And it brings us back again to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 to 17, or at least starting there about verse 8, the Davidic covenant. So the final expression of David's hope and confidence, which gave him peaceful sleep, that we see right there at the end, "I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety." So the final expression of David's hope and confidence, which gave him peaceful sleep, is that the Lord will cause him to dwell in safety. And this is a reference to the coming kingdom of the Messiah. We see this echoing of God's covenant with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that he would make them to dwell safely. He would give them rest from their enemies and plant them in the land. We saw this promised in the law in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse number 28. And we also see this promised in the prophets after, obviously, in looking beyond the exile. References like Jeremiah chapter 23:6, 32:37, several places in Ezekiel and Hosea and Micah that I noted that all use that language of Israel dwelling safely. Okay, applications for Psalm 4. What do I have here?
Well, we shouldn't worry either and let God take care of it, and He'll take care of this virus business, and everything will work out according to His will.
Absolutely. So, two applications from Psalm 4. Number one, Psalm 4 helps us see that we also live in expectation of the coming of Christ. So David himself and those that he's writing to are living in a time when they are looking forward with hope to the coming of Christ. Now, we're not waiting His first coming, obviously, like they were in that time, but we are awaiting His return. We are awaiting His second coming. So in other words, we do have similar circumstances, in a manner of speaking, with this, with those in the psalm. And so, secondly, then, Psalm 4 speaks to us in the midst of distressing circumstances and points us to having confidence in God's promises. So that gives us then, in particular, 4 directives, you'd say, from this psalm. Number 1, we are to refrain from sin through discontent or impatience, losing our hope, becoming desperate or becoming angry because things haven't gone the way we would like. Secondly, we are to call on God and to patiently wait for Him. Be still, know that I am God, as it says in Psalm 46:10. Thirdly, we are to have confidence. We are to have full trust in God, knowing that He will bring all His word to pass. We don't know the timing of all those things. We don't know that. He's not told us that. But we know that it will. He's already fulfilled so much. And then fourthly, we're not to seek shortcuts. We're not to seek some way of trying to have now what only God will give in His own time, according to His own will. Okay, any questions, anything on Psalm 4?